Hello, everyone, and welcome to this three-part Healing Racism webinar series with author, speaker, entrepreneur, diversity innovator, regenerative culture creator, the founder of TMI Consulting, Dr. Tiffany Jana. Dr. Jana, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a great joy and an honor to be able to share a space like this with you. Thank you. My name's Tami Simon. I'm the founder of Sounds True. And right here at the outset, I want to welcome all of you who are joining us, all of our beloved customers, our Sounds True staff, many of our authors, the partner organizations and their staff who have chosen to join us here for this first part of this three-part series. We're going on a walk together to understand more and to embody more at Sounds True over the next 2 years in a deep dive process, working with Dr. Tiffany Jana and TMI Consulting to embody diversity, equity, and inclusion at Sounds True in our workplace and in our products. And we're grateful that right here at the outset, you're joining us for this public series. To begin, Dr. Jana, I'd love for all of our viewers and listeners to get to know you a little bit more. And I wonder if you could introduce yourself, and also for people who are hearing the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what it means for a company to go through that process, if you could explain a little bit about that both.
Sure. Such an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Tami. So a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner is what I call myself. And I have been doing this work for 20 plus years. I come to it by way of family business. It is what my mother does as well. Diversity is the way that we show up. It's all of the different people and all of their various identities as they appear in the workplace, in the world. Inclusion is how do we invite people into the work that we do. So if you can have diversity, but if you don't actually allow people to show up in their fullness and participate fully from their vantage point, then you don't have inclusion. So how do we make space for people to join the work? And then equity is describes how people have opportunities to be successful. So does everyone get what they need in order to be successful in a community, in a workplace, within an environment? So that can look all kinds of different ways, but it is about providing the tools that folks need, regardless of how I might show up in my identities. Can I be successful in this endeavor with you?
And tell us a little bit more about you personally. You mentioned this is a profession that comes in your family, but just to give us a little bit more of a window into you.
Yeah, so for me, the idea of us as one human family is something that became very clear to me at a young age. I'm an Army brat. So I was born in El Paso, Texas, right on the border of Mexico. I picked up Spanish before English. Then we moved to Germany when I was 7. I went to German school and we traveled all over Europe and all over the world from there. My mother was very well traveled before she married a military man. And so as a very young person, I was exposed to difference. I was exposed to culture. I was exposed to so many different kinds of people and expressions. And it just connected me to the reality that while we may have myriad differences, that at the end of the day, you know, when we are alone and afraid and hurt, we cry the same salty tears, that we all have this essential need to feel like we belong, to be loved. And for me, that was an incredibly profound and defining set of formative experiences. So when my mother, you know, started to invite me to follow behind her as she was building offices of multicultural affairs, and she's a pioneer. She's one of the first to really start in this industry. I followed behind her, and I saw how she did this work with such an open heart, and the transformation that was able to be, you know, ushered and possible through her work, that it became a very easy choice to follow in her footsteps.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've received dozens and dozens of questions from the community that's gathered to hear this webinar. And I just want to ask you one more kind of setting the stage question, and then I'm going to get at what the most popular, the most common questions were that were asked, the themes that I really saw coming from the Sounds True community. But the last kind of setting the stage question here that I want to ask you, Dr. Jana, has to do with this notion of embracing diversity through concentric circles of care. When you and I were talking about setting up this series, and I mentioned that I liked the idea of doing 3 parts to give us a chance to really take a journey together, you said, oh, embracing diversity through concentric circles of care. So tell me what you mean by that model, if you will, of concentric circles of care.
Yeah, so I approach all things diversity, equity, and inclusion through this kind of fractal lens that begins at the microscopic level. At the micro level begins with the self, right? So all of my books are written from this perspective as well. What can I do as one human being to show up more inclusively, to behave more equitably, to create a sense of belonging around me? So all of this work must start with the deep introspective questions and a connection to the reality of how life and business and all of the different things are affecting the people around us. So it's got to start with a very heavy piece of personal work. Concentric circles of care just describes the notion of taking that work and then expanding it beyond our own boundaries. While it is important and necessary to begin with the work on ourselves, if it stays within you and it does not influence and affect and touch the lives of the people around you and the systems in which you operate, then you've really limited the possibilities for really creating an equitable and inclusive world. So we start with the self, and then we expand out into our immediate relationships, whether those be family, friends, immediate work teams, associates, and then we expand into the global context, into the institutional, the systemic level challenges and opportunities for us to take the best of what we've learned, who we've become through our inclusion journeys, and to then touch the hearts, minds of other people. And we can do that all the way around the world.
Mm-hmm. All right. So starting with embracing diversity in ourselves, here is some of the key questions that our audience wants to hear you respond to. The first is, I want to be someone who is not simply not a racist. I want to be someone who is anti-racist. How do I do that?
Yes, this is an idea that has been brought into the spotlight by Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. So I highly recommend that folks pick that up. I think it's number 2 on the bestseller list right now. And not being a racist might speak to your ideas, your beliefs, and your values. Being an anti-racist speaks to the actions that you take once you've embraced these more inclusive values. So again, the concentric circle of care comes into play with this confluence of definitions. The anti-racist, the not racist can be descriptive of the individual and the choices and the mindset they choose to occupy. But the anti-racist is actively participating in the world, actively seeking opportunities where they can affect a positive change, where they can promote anti-racist ideas, where they can support anti-racist policies, where they can look at instilling anti-racism into the institutions and the systems all around them.
And the follow-up question to that, what are the most important actions that a white person can take right now to support Black, Indigenous people of color, from your perspective?
So the most important is the subject of this conversation, and that is making sure that you are steeped in the reality of the history of racism in this country and, potentially around the world. So it is very difficult to be a super effective ally, co-conspirator, accomplice for Black people if you are not educated on how we got here. So not only is there this deep introspective piece of work that must be done on the individual level to understand not only what is racism, where did it come from, but how am I benefiting from the systems and structures of racism? How might I be inadvertently, right? It's not often not intentional. How might I be holding those systems of oppression up with my actions, with my purchases, with my words, with all of the various things that make up how I live my life? So the most important thing to do is to begin with the work on the self. And then the next step is, sort of looking beyond the self and looking for active opportunities to be of service.
And in terms of that inner investigation, we received quite a few questions from people who are becoming aware of privilege. People asking about unearned privilege and white privilege. And I know you created a 2014 TED Talk on the power of privilege. Can you help our listeners, first of all, just understand how you see white privilege and unearned privilege, those two concepts?
So the first thing I have to do is define, go ahead and state that there is earned privileged, right? And there is unearned privilege. So people get very hung up on this idea of privilege because there is some kind of, it feels like an indictment, like perhaps I didn't work for something. I didn't assert myself, or I didn't deserve what I have. And that's not necessarily the case. The case with unearned privilege, the case with white privilege, is that privilege itself is simply any aspect of our identities or any aspect of our lives that makes it easier for us to just move through life, right? Anything that allows us to sort of have fewer obstacles, that smooths the path. In the case of white privilege or unearned privilege, it just means that identities through no fault of your own, or aspects of who you are and how you live through no fault of your own, have made your life a little bit easier than it would be for someone with a different set of identities. So privilege, like I'm a person of color with 5 intersectional identities. I'm LGBTQIA, invisible disability, a person of color. I've got all of these different identities that make me who I am. And yet I have plenty of privilege. I have lots of privilege. So people should not feel threatened at this idea of having white privilege. You did not create the system that privileged your white identity. You did not create the system that privileged your unearned privilege, right? But we do have, I believe, a responsibility to own the privilege that we do have, to be really willing to be honest about what that privilege is and how it has advantaged us in our lives. And then once you're comfortable owning the privilege that you have and understanding that it's not an indictment, it's not about culpability, it is about how you choose to leverage that privilege in service of the other, in service of the world, and in this moment, in service of Black people.
Okay, let's talk to that person who just hears the word privilege. And just hearing that word, and immediately that's some kind of hot button, and they feel heat rising and a kind of defensiveness. Just hearing the word. What would you suggest to that person who wants to be on this journey of healing racism?
So the spaces in life where we have a defensive response, where we have a visceral response, that is, in my mind, that is a call from spirit to do deeper investigation. Why? You got to interrogate why you're having that response. Why am I feeling defensive? There's a narrative there. There's a story that underlies that. There's something that you have either been unable or unwilling to examine that at this moment in our collective history, in our collective journey, needs to be examined. And it is important for me as a light worker, as a peace worker, as someone who moves in love and grace, to help you feel safe about exploring that, because your ability to be effective and your ability to create a more beautiful world and a more inclusive world is limited by that defensive response. So if we're able to internalize, whatever is happening there, understand it, really look at it, that's a shadow. That's part of that the parts of us that we don't want to look at. Once we cast a light onto that shadow, we can actually take that privilege and use it for something rather than try to obfuscate it and just remain defensive. There's nothing shameful about being white. I mean, unless one of you is the person who created racism, and there's not a single person on the planet today who's responsible for these systems and structures that we've inherited. However, we each do, I believe, have an individual and collective responsibility to move into healing ourselves and each other. And that begins with asking ourselves, why does it hurt to have this conversation?
Okay, and for that person who says, okay, I'm ready to look into the parts of my life where I've had privilege and maybe where I haven't, both. How would you suggest someone could do that type of assessment to really turn the mirror, look right in the mirror and say, okay, I'm going to look at this?
Well, I mean, I like to do that kind of work with my therapist, to be honest. But this is where not only asking yourself the hard questions, but this is where, I love to pull from the ascended masters from all over the world. And in the Bible, we talk about iron sharpening iron, right? Human beings, when they interact with each other, we make ourselves better versions of each other if we're willing to be in communication with each other, and honest, vulnerable communication. This is where you want to actually hear from and communicate with the people who are closest to you, the people you trust, and start to open up those spaces. Because one of the most challenging journeys that we have is being able to see and experience ourselves the way that other people see and experience us. We're not often connected with that. So I would say, certainly if you have access to people who are learned in the ways of going deep into yourself, access those tools and resources, and then listen to and connect with the people around you who love you. If you invite them into an honest critique and an honest reflection of who you are, you'll often be surprised at what you find.
Okay, and Dr. Jana, here's a question from someone on the Sounds True staff. This person wrote in, when I think of my own white privilege and how many times it has systematically harmed others, I feel an incredible amount of pain, shame, and guilt, some combination of those. Can you speak to this response and offer any tools for moving forward with this work, despite the discomfort that arises?
So I honestly believe that again, those are visceral responses, that when your spirit is jarred by something that you read, hear, see, feel, experience, that is your call to action. And so, I'll just white guilt, right? I'll just go there because it's very appropriate in this moment. White guilt is very challenging because it makes sense. If we look at what's happening today, it is certainly a logical response to feel concerned and guilty and hurt because of these things that have happened, either at the hands of your ancestors, our ancestors, or even things that we're watching today. The trouble with guilt is what we don't want to do is we don't want to feed that monster, right? If we feed that monster, it grows and it keeps us paralyzed and inactive, right? If we allow ourselves to, just like you leverage privilege in service of the other, you can take that guilt and turn it into action. Guilt is paralyzing. Guilt allows us to have, a personal pity party that keeps us from connecting, and it keeps us from being able to interact. If I feel guilty about what my people may have done to your people or a version of your people, then when I'm connecting with you, I can't, my heart can't really be open and I can't be fully present. We've got to try to move that aside and figure out, okay, this troubles me. I'm having an emotional and a visceral response to, this aspect of our history. What am I going to do to be part of the solution? Just like when you volunteer, you're giving service to another, but the healing implications of your volunteer work on your own soul are just enormous. The same thing happens. The guilt, if you focus on it and you look at it and you allow yourself to go into that negative, dark space, you'll be crippled. You'll be unable to move forward. Okay. If you embrace that and you say, okay, this is something that clearly my soul cares very deeply about. Now let me look for the next right step. Let me look for action that I can take in service of this particular space of healing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said something very interesting. You said that none of us alive today created the systemic racism that we were all born into, that we inherited at our birth. And one member of our community wrote in, please help me understand what is my responsibility to dismantle white supremacy. What is my individual responsibility for that?
So when we begin with the work of looking at ourselves and really understanding that history, what is the delusion of white supremacy? What is the history? And how is it affecting the world today? When you're making choices about what it is that you need to respond to. One, those pay so much attention to those gut responses, pay so much attention to the visceral, to the visceral activity that happens with you, because that is your opportunity to say, okay, this thing, not everyone is going to work on every single cause. But when it comes to dismantling white supremacy as a white person, it doesn't matter whether you are a CEO of a major corporation, or if you are a stay-at-home mother, or if you are just starting your own enterprise or retiring from enterprise. Regardless of the life stage and the perceived power that you might have, every single one of us has a sphere of influence, right? Every single one of us has access to something or someone that we can influence. And so once you've studied a little bit about the delusion of white supremacy, then you'll be able to start to make connections as to how it's affecting the systems that you are operating in. Once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. And as a white person, once you see it, then you can start naming it. And once you name it, you find more people who are of like mind, and you can begin to tear those systems down. What has been utterly it's awful, but remarkable at the same time, is that this construct of white supremacy, it's literally the water that we swim in. It's the air that we breathe. It's the default operating code of our nation. And it is affecting everything around us, but it is simultaneously invisible. So you've got to educate yourself about how these structures work, and then do what you can to make the changes within your sphere of influence. You don't have to take it all down at one time. That's not any individual's job. The interesting thing about this is that everything that we're seeing as it pertains to the way that people are being affected and being marginalized and oppressed because of these racist constructs and these sexist constructs and these homophobic constructs, we have to understand that they were designed with great intention. There's nothing accidental about the world that we live in right now. Our system is functioning as it was designed to function. It was always exclusive, right? From the penning of the Constitution, right? We weren't thinking about everybody equally. So what it will require from us as a people, as a one human family, one human race, is a very intentional set of actions towards inclusion, towards equity, and very intentional dismantling of white supremacist systems. So we need everyone. It's not even you should feel bad because you don't have the ultimate power. We need everyone to look at these white supremacist systems from their vantage point and do what they can from where they are. Because if each of us took on that responsibility, we'd have a very different world in a very short order.
In your introduction, I referred to you as a regenerative culture creative, a creator, regenerative culture creator. And, I don't think I've ever introduced anyone and referred to them that way before. And as you're speaking, that's what's coming up for me. So I wonder what that means to you to be a regenerative culture creator.
Yes, I am profoundly blessed to be able to wake up every day and serve the world in a way that is very meaningful to individuals, to cultures, to institutions, right? And I believe that all of our systems, all of our structures can be recalibrated towards the regeneration of spirit. Right now, we are living with the legacy of industrial revolution style management systems, structures, institutions that were never designed to privilege the human spirit, that were never designed to make people feel healthy, whole, or welcome. And we've done a lot of, there's a lot of incremental changes that are, little, the little consolation prizes for people who happen to be employed or people who happen to be living within specific communities. And regenerative culture creation is about recognizing that all of us need to be given the latitude to shine our individual lights as brightly as possible, as authentically as possible, wherever we are. The idea that anyone has to edit themselves in order to conform to some kind of structure or some kind of system or some kind of social construct it's harmful. It is harmful to the individual human spirit, and it is harmful to the collective, because if you can't be everything that you were sent here to be, then the entire human narrative is missing an essential piece. We all have to be here to do the thing. So the regenerative culture creation is about being very intentional about creating cultures wherever we are. I do so much of my work in the workplace context, and in the workplace context, often culture just happens by default. People are focused on a business product, on a service, on something that they're delivering. They hire, the best people that they can, or the people that they can find from their networks, and the company grows, and culture just happens by default. When you put enough people together in a group, a culture will emerge. And what my, sort of thesis has been all of these years is that you can very intentionally, and should very intentionally, define the day-to-day lived experience that you want the beautiful human spirits that are supporting your mission to have. I know that I want my people, in the context of my company, I know that I want people to feel like they can be who they are, that they can be human, that they can feel pain, that they can bring their home stuff to work, because who can compartmentalize, right? It's very important that we be able to let people be authentic and live free, and that the work itself becomes something that regenerates the spirit as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what the invitation that comes up for me is that all of us are invited to be regenerative culture creators. In fact,
Yes.
We need all of us to be doing that. Okay, your first book that you co-wrote was Overcoming Bias. And one of the interesting things I read in that book is that the development of bias is actually a normal function of the human brain, unconscious bias. And I wonder if you can explain that. I noticed I felt a relief when I read that, oh, it's just my brain kind of doing what the brain does.
Yes. Yeah, so it is, our brain is wired for shortcuts, right? Our brain is always looking for an easier way, an easier path, the shortest distance between the 2 points. And, one of the challenges for humanity today is that, the rate at which we are exposed to data and information, the volume of data and information that we are inundated with on a daily basis, I don't think that we've had time as a species to catch up with this, information influx that has happened. It's just such an exponential rise in the last few decades. So what happens is your brain has to learn how to filter out information, and it has to create shortcuts all the time. With unconscious bias, like overt biases, the things that you love and don't love, like that's a whole different animal. But the unconscious bias is the realm of, it's like the sum total of the messages that you have seen, read, or heard, or internalized, often about people. So your unconscious bias about flavor differences and preferences of books or whatever doesn't cause as much harm as the bias that you may not be aware of that you have about certain groups of people. And when that happens, the lazy brain, the example I like to use is from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, right? So the 2 + 2, everyone knows, very quickly equals 4. Fast brain, it's accessible. 75 times 36. Your slow brain wakes up and goes, hey, blue-haired person, I'm not really, you're not giving me enough of a reward for me to put myself through that mental Olympics to give you that answer. And there's a handful of people who can figure it out, and more power to you. But what happens in your mind when you hear a challenge like that, that is your brain saying, I'm not going to use brain glucose on this particular problem right now because it's not worth it. And so if we don't become aware of where our unconscious bias lies when it pertains to the people we interact with, then I can 100% guarantee you that you are treating people, real live breathing human beings, you are treating them negatively based on biases that you're not even aware of. So I believe that it is imperative that we as a species, one, be prepared to acknowledge, right? To acknowledge that bias is just a part of how we're wired. It's a survival mechanism. And two, if you have biases, unconscious bias about people, I believe that we have a responsibility to find them so that we can get out of our own way and interrupt those biases when we are faced with people about whom we might have bias.
Mm-hmm. How do we uncover what our unconscious bias is? I mean, the nature of unconscious is that I'm not conscious of it. So yeah, so how do I uncover my unconscious
Exactly.
bias?
So one of the tools that we point people to is the implicit association test, also known as the IAT, and that is an ongoing study by Harvard where they give you the opportunity to do some rapid fire testing that will kind of quantify and calibrate your unconscious bias across a great many categories. And so that is one way, and you can choose. I recommend that if people do that, you do at least 3 of them, and that you, if you like to imbibe, have a glass of wine handy, because when you get your results, it's going to hurt your feelings. It's going to insult you, and you're going to feel bad. But remember, Dr. Jana said, your unconscious bias is not your fault, right? If you are alive, breathing human today on Earth, you've got unconscious bias, and that's just real. The other way to uncover them is to listen again to the visceral response. You are your greatest teacher. We're just often not listening to that great teacher within us. So when you have that response to situations, to people, if you're walking down the street and you find yourself getting a little nervous because you just saw a Black man walking towards you in the other direction, you need to listen to whatever happened inside of you in that moment, and also listen to the feedback that you're getting from people around you. We are incredibly defensive and dismissive of the very helpful information we're getting from people, right? So Susan at your office probably made a comment to you 2 weeks ago about the way that you said something to her. And in your mind, oh, I didn't mean to cause any harm. Susan is just hypersensitive. No, you need to think about what Susan said and ask yourself a few questions about what that was about. Oftentimes we're having the mirror reflected back at us, but we don't want to see that reflection.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed is simply by asking myself to become aware of unconscious bias in myself, I've just asked myself to do it. I'm noticing it all the time. I'm just noticing it all the time. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, it's like just even, kind of invoking that awareness. Now, in your book, you talk about first there's awareness of our unconscious bias, but then we can actually, and these are strong words, we can conquer unconscious bias, and then we can prevail so that it doesn't arise in our minds. And I thought, okay, I need to understand more about conquering and prevailing.
Yes. So when we talk about conquering and prevailing, we're talking about an individual bias. We're not talking about the propensity for it. We're talking about an individual bias, right? And so once you're able to identify, based on some experience that I've had, based on some, bad information that I got from really good people growing up who were raising me the best that they could, I'm harboring biases that I was less aware of than I am now. Once you are aware of them, that is definitely step one. The conquering comes from being intensely present in your moments, like being present in your reality, being present in your moments is what allows you to get over the autopilot response. Like unconscious bias lives in the realm of the busy, the tired, the overworked, the stressed, which all of us are. But if you know that you have a bias about a particular demographic of people, and you are a hiring manager, or you're on part of a panel that is vetting a series of candidates, if you have identified through doing the hard work that you hold a particular bias about a person, then when you see that person on that candidate slate, then you have the opportunity to allow that human being to show you who they are, because our biases are based on stereotypes and judgments and experiences that have nothing to do with the person who's in front of you. So once you know, then you can put the grown-up intelligent person in the driver's seat and not let that autopilot take over, because that autopilot's not terribly intelligent. And then the prevailing is, this is like, it's like working out, right? You don't go to the gym one time and you're like, yeah, I'm diesel, I'm good to go. No, you got to keep going, right? It's like hygiene, right? You don't get to take one shower and then it's like, I've done that, I'm checked that box. No, you got to clean yourself every day, right? And so it's the same thing with this work. The prevailing happens when over and over and over again, you've been presented with the opportunity to face your unconscious bias, to make an intentionally inclusive set of choices, right? To act in a way that is new for you. And then what happens is that becomes your new normal. And prevailing is when you can look back in the rearview mirror and say, holy moly, like that is not one of my biases anymore. And that absolutely can be done. Now you got to rinse and repeat because a whole bunch of new ones are going to pop up behind that one.
Now, if it's okay, could I ask you a personal question? And would you be willing to share with us from your own life experience an unconscious bias that you became aware of, conquered, and now have a prevailing, you got it, doesn't affect you anymore?
Yeah. So the one that comes to mind is the one that I put in the book because it was so incredibly alarming for me. And that was that when I was a teenager, I worked in a haute couture fashion house. And there was a population of people who consistently came into the store and attempted to haggle. They attempted to haggle on all the prices because that was a part of, their culture. And it was frustrating, and I, dealt with it over and over again. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that when I saw, and this was for me, this was people of Indian descent, right? It was people of Indian descent who were consistently haggling in this particular location. And then I started to notice that when Indian people started to approach me in any particular situation, I would tense up and I was bracing for a fight. I was bracing for not a physical fight, but this like, okay, I'm going to have to like defend something, because I had been conditioned over time to be ready for somebody who was going to haggle with me. And when I realized it, it was definitely alarming. And it wasn't until I had an opportunity to be exposed to some people and be in personal relationship. I sat on a board of directors with a brilliant young Indian man who I realized that I had the bias, and I had to allow this person to be who they were. And I had to give that person latitude to show me something that counteracted my own narrative. And it took me a while to get there. Now, I have so many Indian friends. No, I have a lot of respect for this culture. I have studied more about this culture, and, they have now become part of my human family. But through no fault of my own, I wasn't trying to have any biases, but I had a set of experiences that made me feel defensive. That was definitely between the period of, high school when that happened and my, mid to early 20s when I was sitting on that board of directors. There's a period where I don't think I was terribly nice to Indian people. And I didn't think that I was doing anything, but based on the reaction that I became aware of once I woke up to myself, I know that I had a bias, and I know that I had to be treating people badly.
Mm-hmm. No, your story, and thank you for sharing that. I think it makes it just makes it so real for people. So thank you. Yeah. The subtitle of the book, Overcoming Bias, is Building Authentic Relationships Across Differences. And that's what your story pointed to as part of the healing of that bias. And one person on our staff wrote in this question. Colorado has a significant minority population, projected to be 46% by the end of the year 2020. Yet I feel like I live in a white bubble. What can I do to change that? And I'm asking this in the context of building authentic relationships across differences. And for those of us who feel that we're living in some type of white bubble, what can we do?
So the bubble that you live in is called the United States of America. And we are very unfortunately more segregated now than we were in the height of legalized segregation, because all across the country, if you happen to go to some kind of house of worship, if you live in a neighborhood, if you're sending your children to school, you are most likely surrounded by people who are just like you racially, just like you socioeconomically, just like you educationally. It is unfortunate that this is now how we live. What you can do is you have to intentionally diversify your network. You have to intentionally put yourself in situations that are probably going to be uncomfortable, but situations where you show up with and for and beside people who are different from you. Right now is a great opportunity to do so, as we now have such a loud and beautiful crescendo of voices that are coming from all across the world, united around the liberation of Black people in particular. So there are a lot of organizations, institutions, causes that you can join without having to feel terribly conspicuous about doing it. But you have to just show up. And it's a little bit, while on the one hand, there are many opportunities right now, I have to caution you about, particularly with Black people right now, there's a very heavy emotional tax to being Black in America and being Black in the workplace. And what I want to caution you about is, like, don't expect for Black people to educate you about racism. That is your responsibility, and that is a journey that you must go on with yourself. You take that on with yourself, and then you start having conversations with other white people, maybe other white people who are further along on that journey, before you really start, kind of pitching that over at Black people, because we're exhausted right now. And we are not here for your education. Now, me, different story. I'm an educator in this space, and this is my whole passion. But so find yourself, if you look around, even the whitest of cities that tell me, well, we didn't mean to make an entirely white organization. We just can't find the Black people. I promise you that if this is America, you go, there is an other side of the tracks, because we very intentionally, through redlining, concentrated Blackness and concentrated poverty, generational poverty, into certain areas of our cities, right? So you can find certainly parts of your city, parts of your state that require assistance, and you can also find things like professional associations and clubs, et cetera, that are, so for instance, every professional association you can think of, like certified public accountants. There's a National Association of Black certified public accountants. There's a National Association of Black engineers. So for all of these associations you can think of, there are versions that have different ethnicities that are very specific, and there are opportunities for you to come and network. If you're representing an organization, there are opportunities for you to come and present and build relationships so that you can expand your hiring base, for instance.
Okay, just a few more questions here, Dr. Jana. A member of our community wrote in, as a white woman, very committed to my own spiritual work, I've always strived to see the oneness in us all. But I fear now there may be some colorblindness built into that assumption that doesn't allow for honor and respond to difference. What's the balance?
So colorblindness is a terrible construct, right? Colorblindness is really problematic because if you claim to not see my color, then you are erasing and rendering invisible a very important aspect of my identity. My Blackness precedes most of my other identities. So it has shaped the way that I move through the world, and it has shaped the experiences that I have. So to tell your children to be colorblind, to ignore color in any way, only perpetuates the problems that we're seeing. So we definitely want to stay away from that. The essential oneness, the unity of us as a human species, as a human race, that is just a fact, right? Race is the lie. Race is a social construct. As you do your history on dismantling white supremacy, you'll begin to understand that we made race up in order to justify some very, very horrific behavior against our fellow humans. So you can do both. You can simultaneously acknowledge and honor and lift up and nurture the oneness of all of us, while still saying there are differences, right? You can love your whole family and still have, men and women and children and gender nonconforming people and older people and differently able people, but we're still one family. So those aspects that make us the rainbow or the cornucopia that represent all of the different ways we show up, they're beautiful aspects of identity that make this human experience more and more rich. The way that I like to think about it is that I believe that we're all powered by one universal energy, and we're just moving around and we're bumping around in different spaceships. My lens of my spaceship, my windshield is blue, right? And maybe Tami, maybe yours is pink. I don't know. But the experience of right? Pink, it works. So the experience to me of being in relationship with the human family is I will never know what it was like flying in a spaceship with a pink windshield if mine was blue and on a different trajectory. So the beauty of getting to interact with each other is being able to share what those different experiences of universal energy inside of a very specific spaceship is. So support the oneness, lift up the oneness, but don't deny the beauty that exists in our individuality.
Okay, and this question from a Sounds True staff member who says, I don't want to ask the Black, Indigenous people of color to educate me about race, but I do want to support our friends and colleagues right now at Sounds True and in our extended community who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. What can I do to be a true person of support right now?
So it starts with listening, right? So the communities of which you speak are making it known what is needed. So if you are tapped in, if you are connected, then you need to listen to what each individual, each group, each constituency is asking for, how they need support. The more authentic relationships that you have built or can build across difference, the more proximity you have, the easier it will be to get that information and sort of gain that, gain that understanding. But listen, because everyone is telling you what they need. If you have enough proximity to be able to reach out to people, I personally am a fan of the reach out that says, hey, Tiffany, my heart is breaking right now, watching what is happening to, your people, our people. I want you to know that I have your back. Let me know if there's anything I can do to support you. No need to respond to this text. And that last line is so important because BIPOC people, like Black, Indigenous people of color, are being inundated with messages from well-meaning white people who want to show support, and a few people who are performing, oh my gosh, I'm not racist, please don't think I'm a racist. If your BIPOC friends don't know that you're not a racist and you need to send that text message for that reason, that's a deeper piece of work for you. If you're genuinely trying to extend support and let folks know that you are there for them and that your heart is breaking with them, then you can say that, but don't expect a response because we're exhausted and we're overwhelmed.
Okay, and for that person who's inspired by this conversation, perhaps to reach out across difference in one way or another, but also feels some quality of, a nice way to put it would be tentativeness. A more direct way would be to say they are scared that they are going to screw up. How do we do this work and accept the fact that we might do it quite imperfectly?
We will do it quite imperfectly. Just like I'm asking you to embrace the reality that the human brain is wired for bias, right? Overt and unconscious bias. It is impossible to do this work perfectly. I am a diversity expert, a thought leader who has won a great number of awards and whatnot, right? Best-selling author on some lists. And every single day, I misgender someone, I dead name someone, I step in a pile of hot, steamy diversity dung because it's impossible to do this exactly perfectly. Because the nature of the work is that there is no panacea, right? There's no silver bullet. There's no one size fits all that is going to instantly make you perfectly culturally fluent and impenetrable to the mistakes that are inherent in the human condition. So the most important thing on this journey is to have grace for yourself and to have grace for others, because we are all going to mess up. But the remarkable thing about the human spirit is that, we get defensive when we mess up, and we go into the, I didn't mean to cause harm and you're just, right? Human beings can tell when you're setting out to cause harm. Human beings can tell when maybe you're just not very motivated to do the work. And human beings can tell when you are, whatever your underlying motive is. There are a lot of people who are very sensitive to that. So check your motives before you communicate. Think about what it is that you're doing. And remember that there is no time at which I get to remove my Blackness, right? There's no time at which I get to stop being who I am. And I still have to take hit after hit after hit after hit, microaggression after microaggression every day, because that's just how it works. So we don't want our white allies to give up the fight because it gets hard, right? We will question your ally status if you give up that easily. What we need you to do is recognize that you're going to fall, but get back up, have some grace for yourself, recognize that you can't be perfect, but get back in the fight and do it again and again. It's not easy work, but it's worth it.
What do you mean by have some grace for yourself? What do you mean by that?
So you've got to be gentle with yourself, right? So what happens, it's the pity party again. So I mess up and then I feel so terrible that I'm paralyzed by my own guilt, right? So I feel bad because I was trying really hard and I just wanted to make friends and communicate support to that person of color, and I said the wrong thing and now they're mad at me, so I'm not going to say anything else again. I'm just going to go back to my bubble and leave it alone. That's not the response we want you to have. I want you to have the response that, you know what, I am a loving and gracious human being who is trying, and you say this to yourself, and you tell yourself, you invite yourself to try to do better next time. And in that relationship, again, we say, when we're confronted with our own foibles, we say, thank you for making me aware of what happened. And please let me know what I can do to make it right. And then we go and we learn and we grow from that place, and we just do better next time.
And I want to address all of our listeners right now. If you have further questions or thoughts that arise that you'd like to ask Dr. Jana a week from today, so that would be July 1st, we'll be having our second session in this series at the same time, 8 o'clock Eastern time, 5 o'clock Pacific, 6 o'clock here, Mountain time. And we'll gather all the questions that we get, both from the Sounds True staff and our broader community, and we'll distill it down. We'll be looking at embracing diversity in our communities and organizations and moving one step further out in this concentric circle. To end, Dr. Jana, one of our listeners asked, please ask Dr. Jana, what are 3 principles that Dr. Jana lives by? 3 principles.
3? Okay, I get a bunch. So one is cheating here. One is the grace, right? Always moving in grace for myself and grace for others. Second is joy. So I'm a pleasure activist and liberation through joy. And that is, from the just choosing to be happy and brown and in all these identities is a radical act of revolution. And so seeking that joy all the way to liberating bodies through joy is a very real thing. And then the third one is just staying connected to source. I am not just a human doing. I am a human being who is powered by spirit, who is, inspired by spirit, and trying to live out my highest mission on earth.
What a bold, brave human you are, and a beautiful torchbearer. Thank you. Thank you so much. Come join us for our second part, again, July 1st, 8 p.m. Eastern time, where we'll take this series on healing racism to the next step. Thanks for walking together with Sounds True while we continue our mission of waking up the world. Thank you.
Thank you.